Welcome to the Center for American Progress. My name is Jocelyn Fry. I'm a senior fellow here with the Women's Initiative. It's great to have all of you here for our conversation about next steps on equal pay and specifically next steps for progress on equal pay. As many of you, if not everybody in this room knows, one topic that has received a lot of discussion this week is the topic of equal pay for equal work. That's because Tuesday was officially Equal Pay Day, and as many of you know, Equal Pay Day is the day that we have to symbolize the moment in which women catch up with men. On that day, it is the day that women, on average, have to work into 2016 in order to earn the same amount that men have earned through 2015. As again, many of you know, women earn on average 79 cents to a dollar that every man earns. Those numbers are even more stark for women of color. African American women earn 60 cents, Latinas 55 cents, Native American women 58 cents, Asian American women earn 84 cents, but it is varied very much by subpopulation and can go as low as 30 or 40 cents depending on the group that you're talking about. So there's a lot of discussion about what it is that we need to do to remedy not only the wage gap, but ensure that people are indeed paid fairly for their work. And we want to have a conversation today about not simply what we can do to make a difference, but what are the problems? What is it that we need to fix? It is clear, if you look at every poll that I've ever seen, that there is actually wide consensus around the concept and principle of equal pay for equal work, regardless of whether you're talking to men or women, people of color. It rests at the heart of our nation's commitment to equality and fairness. And so it is important for us to focus on how do we make that principle that we all uphold actual a reality in practice. And we want to use today's discussion to really tease out the practical implications and policies and solutions that we can pursue to make a difference. I'm going to welcome our panel, and as they come up to the stage, I will introduce them, and then we will have a conversation about the topic of equal pay, and then after we've discussed it with them, we'll open it up for questions. So I'm going to invite our panelists to come up. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And as I said, we have a stellar panel to talk about what are the next steps for progress on equal pay. And I'm going to introduce them alphabetically. They're not seated alphabetically, but that's okay. And then we're going to get into our conversation. Deborah Thompson-Eisenberg, at my far right, is a professor of law and faculty director of the Center for Dispute Resolution at the University of Maryland's Francis King Carey School of Law. She teaches in employment law. She is really one of the leading experts on equal pay law in the country. She focuses also on dispute resolution and civil procedure. Before teaching at the University of Maryland, she was a practitioner, worked for more than 15 years as a civil litigator. So she knows a lot about the practice of law and how these issues come up in the legal setting. Debbie Meslow is Vice President of Public and Government Affairs at GAP. And thank you for being here. She oversees all of the external values-based communication and public policy efforts at GAP. She has been engaged in a number of issues around women's advancement in particular. She's the Vice President of the San Francisco Commission for the Status of Women. She's also a founding member of Emerge America, a national organization that focuses on helping and encouraging women to run for office. So thank you for being here. Seated immediately next to me is Renee Redwood. Renee is the CEO of Redwood Enterprise LLC, She is a long-standing expert on diversity and inclusion practices. She's worked for a variety of clients, both in the private and public sector. She works a lot with folks on organizational development and really how do you change culture of workplaces. In one of her prior roles, she was the executive director of the Federal Glass Ceiling Commission. That was created by the Civil Rights Act of '91 and focused on the range of practices that we need to pursue to actually ensure that we can really, truly, finally break the glass ceiling. Thank you for being here. And last but certainly not least, we are pleased to have the chair of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Jenny Yang. She was appointed by President Obama to that position in September 2014. She joined the commission in, I think it was April of 2013, and has, prior to becoming the chair, was the vice chair. And she has really been a leader in moving EEOC to really look at systemic practices and really try to dig deep into how do we really remove discrimination from the workplace entirely. Prior to joining the commission, she too has had an impressive career in the legal field. She was a partner at a law firm. She's also practiced and done employment rights for low-income workers, I think garment workers, and has been also a litigator for the federal government. She worked in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. So I think you can tell from the people that we have gathered here that we have sort of a wide range of expertise on not only what the legal problems are, but also how do we begin to address them. So I want to start actually with talking just a little bit about the state of play. And Deb, I'm going to start with you. And you know, as I said in my brief opening remarks, there's enormous support for equal pay. Like, there's nobody who says, I'm against equal pay. Everybody says they're for it, they like it, and happy, happy, happy. However, we also hear a lot of discussion about, you know, that there are things that we need to fix, and that even though we have a law in theory, that it doesn't always work as well as it should. So I wonder if you could start, just because you've done so much research in this space, and talk a little bit about what the state of play is. You know, what are the problems that we need to address? Is the law okay? Do we need to fix it? You know, what's your sense of it?
Yeah, sure. So yes, the law does promise equal pay for equal work, but what I find in my research is there are lots of impediments for women or men who sue under these laws and trying to seek their protections. And there are two basic laws. There's, of course, the Equal Pay Act, and this was passed during the manufacturing era, right, in 1963. And I think that what we're seeing now is that when courts try to apply a law that was based on a manufacturing economy where people were working in essentially assembly line cookie cutter jobs to the modern economy where they may not be exactly equal jobs, most women lose these cases. Mm-hmm. Vast majority do. So Lily Ledbetter, for example, we're really familiar with her Title VII discrimination claim, but she did have an equal pay claim that was dismissed very early.
Right.
At the trial court level. She was a manager in one department. Her pay was less than all of the men managing other departments, but the court said, well, that's not equal work because you're managing different departments. So that is a problem under the Equal Pay Act again and again, and it imposes a type of wage glass ceiling on many women. So as women climb into managerial or upper level positions, they're in a sense working their way out of the Equal Pay Act's protections. And then the other law, the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, requires a showing of intentional discrimination, right? And in a lot of these cases, it's not intentional discrimination as you might think of, you know, blatant sexism, which certainly still exists in some cases. But a lot of cases, it's a case of deliberate indifference, you know, not really taking it seriously and allowing pay problems to snowball over time. And also having wholly discretionary processes. And studies show that when you have a lot of discretion in individual managers, without really company oversight into how pay will be established, it allows unconscious stereotypes to creep into the pay setting process and lower women's wages.
Well, that's, thank you. That's really helpful just in understanding the lay of the land. How, generally speaking, and I know you've looked at this, how successful are people when they try to bring these cases? Do most of them get into court? Do they not even get into court? What happens?
So under the Equal Pay Act, which is what I've studied the most, there's something called the prima facie threshold standard, right? You have to show, before you can get to is the pay equal, you have to get to can these jobs be compared? Is this equal work? And I did an examination of all appellate cases in the federal courts from the time the Equal Pay Act was passed through 2009 is when I did this study. And I found that looking decade by decade, women are less successful now in Equal Pay Act claims than they have been in any other decade. So in the 70s, it was a 59% success rate, 52 in the 80s, 55 in the 90s. From 2000 to 2009, they had a 35% success rate on appeal. So you don't expect every claimant to win, but clearly there's been a drop there. Something's going on. And then I also did another study where I looked at the actual trial courts, the federal district courts, what's happening at that level. And I found that 70% of the cases are dismissed at the summary judgment stage, which means they're kind of getting stopped right at the starting gate. They're not getting to juries. The actual analysis of what is this really discriminatory pay is never really reached.
And can you explain for folks what summary judgment is? Because just sort of what does that mean procedurally?
So summary judgment is basically supposed to be no disputed facts about the case, right? Because juries are supposed to decide facts. And the parties write briefs to the judge and say, Judge, we don't dispute any of the facts. This case can be decided as a matter of law. So it's sort of the judge ruling on the papers. And these cases are supposed to be very fact intensive, right? There are a lot of credibility determinations there. So this overuse of summary judgment in these cases, I think, is a real cause for concern.
So in other words, I thought two things you said were really interesting. One is going back to where you started, that just because of the way the workforce has changed, that the jobs aren't sort of easily comparable as they used to be. And so you see that reflected in the percentages of success in terms of the Equal Pay Act, that it's gone down, perhaps in part because jobs aren't exactly the same or don't look exactly the same in the same way anymore. And then this other notion that one of the mechanisms that courts use to actually evaluate cases is they look at the paper and sort of figure out, is this a case that's ready to move forward? Is it something that I can just figure out because of what the law requires me to do, or is there a factual dispute that needs to be considered?
Right. Can this case get to trial?
Right.
Should this go to a jury?
Right. And in a lot of cases, equal pay cases, they never even get to trial.
That's correct. That's correct.
Right.
And in looking at sort of why is the judge granting summary judgment, nearly half of the time it's because of that prima facie threshold. It's not because of anything else. So that the courts aren't really looking at the merits of is this pay discrimination. They're just looking at can these two jobs, can this particular plaintiff even state a case?
Right.
So to give you an example from my practice, just to give you an example of how this plays out, I once represented a female chief technology officer. She was the only female executive on the team. And the discretionary components of her pay were much, much lower than her male executive peers. So they had a base salary amount that was about the same, but her annual bonuses were half that of all the men, and her stock options, which were the real gold, the real value compensation in this kind of work, were about a quarter of her male peers. So we actually lost her claim under the federal Equal Pay Act, but won her claim under the Maryland Equal Pay Act, which has a more pragmatic prima facie standard, which looks at, are these two jobs comparable, right? Is it work of a comparable character? So that kind of standard is, I think, a much more realistic standard for the modern economy.
Thank you. And it sort of highlights sort of one specific problem that is folks are encountering, which is just making it clear that these jobs actually compare to each other. And I think, in California, they actually just passed a new law where, the standard that they used is a little bit broader to get at that issue. And, I want to bring the chair into the conversation because I know some of your regulations actually speak to this issue. They talk specifically about the fact that equal doesn't always mean the same. Right, like an equal actually is broader than that. And I wondered if you have a unique perspective because you have all of these charges that come into you around issues of wages. And can you just give us a sense of what do you see in terms of how these cases are playing out and the challenges you face in trying to pursue these cases?
Well, thanks, Jocelyn. And I think Deb really highlighted some of the key issues we see in our charges as well. We have 53 offices around the country where people can come in and file charges, and we've made equal pay one of our national priority areas, in part because it's been so hard to get people to come forward and identify problems. But what we've seen is across industries. So even in heavily female-dominated industries, so you see women cashiers, retail salespeople, HR executives facing pay problems, and also women, at the college professor level, so we see it happening through the gamut. One of the issues, when you say everybody agrees equal pay is a good thing, many people believe that what is driving equal pay is either women's choices, sort of this failure to negotiate, and so they think you can explain it all away. But what we see when we look at our investigations, we're comparing people in the same job with others in the same job with similar experience, and we're seeing those pay disparities continue. So let me give you one example. We filed a friend of the court brief in an appellate court where a woman college professor was hired at the same time as a male. And they had the same experience. They had, in fact, the same degree from the same university, so it was a unique set of facts. The compensation committee had recommended they start at the same salary. But they ended up paying the male $10,000 more. And so in the course of litigation, the employer said, well, the reason we did it is because he negotiated. So when he wanted to raise a higher salary, they brought it up to the top and they gave him a higher salary. But then there's emails actually documenting that the female professor also tried to negotiate for a higher salary, and she was shot down right at the beginning. And so I think that is one of the examples that I've also seen in my practice where women are actually trying to negotiate. They are just either facing backlash as a result or their efforts are being shot down. So that emphasizes the importance of employer practices, because I think what we see often as well is it is a lack of attention. And there is not a belief that we have a problem here. So employers aren't really carefully monitoring their practices. They're not thinking about, if we just allow a lot of discretion and don't provide guidance on how to set pay, when people come in, it should just come out fairly. And we were at an event at the White House on Equal Pay Day where we were talking about some of these issues, and someone made the point that we need to move from a sort of a norm of unconscious bias to conscious inclusion, right? So it can't just be, well, we didn't know that was happening, but right, it is sort of an obligation for all employers to really look at their practices and see what's happening. Because what we've also seen is when women come forward, sometimes another woman we represented saw on a share drive, she discovered working late at night that a man in the same job as a drafter in a manufacturing company was paid $4,000 more. And when she raised it, they were irate that she was talking about pay and they were threatened to fire her. So there is that backlash. Even when you find out, it's hard to find out there's a problem in the first place, and then when they do, people can face retaliation, including termination, and we see that over and over again as well.
Right. So that it's interesting. So your case is sort of reinforce what Deb was saying about some of the problems, but also some other issues, just about, maybe even the assumptions of what the problem is, that people sometimes just think it's choices or what have you and aren't really looking at their practices, and they may not even have good practices, really. But then also, fear of retaliation, fear of, what happens if I talk about my pay, those types of issues are all things that you encounter. The other thing I wanted you to speak to is that Deb talked about the unique difficulties with the Equal Pay Act, and a lot of times these cases being brought under Title VII, since all of these statutes are things that you enforce.
Right.
You know, what's your experience in terms of, you know, the challenges of pursuing these cases under one law versus another?
Right.
You know, my sense is, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that most of your pay discrimination cases are actually not Equal Pay Act cases. They're brought under Title VII. And
Right.
so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, we have brought cases under both statutes since, you know, we've been participating in the Equal Pay Task Force that the White House created in 2010. And since that time, we have recovered over $85 million on pay discrimination issues alone. But we know that's sort of just the tip of the iceberg. Often our Equal Pay Act cases tend to be smaller. The benefit of the Equal Pay Act is you don't have to prove intent. Where you actually have a man in a position that is similar, we do see same job issues in the same facility. The statute can be helpful. The harder issue is often when you're trying to show large or systemic discrimination, because then you're going to multi-establishment. And then you get into the question of, is that the same establishment? Who's doing the hiring? We had a case that we filed in New York challenging a state effort to, a payment plan, a payment structure where women lawyers were being paid less in the aggregate than male lawyers. And we were talking, but some of it had to do with the different fields in which women lawyers operated and male lawyers operated. And we tried to demonstrate it's essentially the same job. It's the same background, the experience, the job descriptions, but the court was not persuaded because she said, well, lawyers do different jobs, and that's not similar enough to support the analysis. So we've had trouble in those sort of situations too in trying to demonstrate that the job is similar enough. So I think there are opportunities to try to strengthen even the interpretations of the law that exists now.
Right.
Some courts have adopted, well, negotiation is a factor other than sex, which is can be an affirmative defense under the Equal Pay Act, and say, well, that wasn't, you know, based on gender. But other courts are saying, well, it is. That in itself, that type of factor can be discriminatory. So I think the law is still continuing to evolve in that area, but it's disheartening to hear that the statistics, right, and how hard it's becoming.
Right, right. I'm familiar with that case. It is very frustrating, you know, particularly when, and we may want to talk about this earlier, that for a variety of reasons, women sometimes are concentrated in certain fields, you know, whether it's the legal profession and whether they prefer certain types of practice areas or certain types of jobs. And so I think that can be a challenge. The other thing I wanted to raise with you before I move to Debbie was, we often think about pay discrimination solely in gender terms, and in particular women being underpaid. But one of the things that I think is striking about some of the work that you're doing is that it's much broader, right? Like, you know, cases are brought by men and other folks. And can you talk just about the diversity of folks who bring pay discrimination cases?
Sure. I think we have seen pay discrimination affecting many different groups. So we have, for example, brought a case on behalf of a Latino man who was denied overtime payments, but other workers were given overtime payments, right? And that can also violate our statute because of national origin discrimination. We've seen African Americans being paid less, and then when you look at the data, it's driven more sometimes in this one particular workplace I'm thinking of by a denial of opportunities to advance. So African Americans may be hired at the first level, entry-level jobs. They are not promoted even though they're the most qualified applicant pool and have the skills to do that job. So it's both people aren't hired into those higher level jobs, and people aren't advancing. So you also see the pay as a result of discrimination that might be commonly viewed as promotion or hire rather than straight pay discrimination. And we also see issues for people with disabilities. You know, some of you may be familiar with our Henry's Turkeys case, but in that case, men with intellectual disabilities were paid much less than others who did not have those disabilities. And they weren't able to really assert their rights, and it was only through a relative that we heard about that problem. But there were over 30 men who were really living in terrible conditions who we were able to get one of the largest jury awards that we had ever gotten, which was later reduced for statutory caps, but it was on behalf of these 30 men who were underpaid as a result of their disability.
That is very interesting. I think people just often don't think about it. They don't think about these cases being brought by men. They don't think about other groups, folks with disabilities. I know I've seen research on folks, LGBT workers, that all show sort of some level of pay disparities.
Right.
So I think it's interesting that that's reflected in the work that you
Right.
do.
And I've also seen it in my practice over the course of my experience on behalf of Asian Americans. Because even in a field like engineering, where there's a high representation of Asian Americans, there's still pay disparities, promotion barriers, because people may see someone as technically competent, but not a leader, or not somebody who can advance. So you see the ways in which pay practices, which might require, a champion or other things to sort of impact how people are paid.
Thank you. I want to move to you, Debbie, because I want to take a slightly different perspective on it, because we've talked a little bit about sort of the legal lay of the land and the different laws and sort of what's available, the limits and some of the challenges. But, obviously a lot of this is addressed in the workplace,
right,
and really is on employers and employees to sort of try to figure out on a day-to-day basis what makes sense. And I know that GAP has invested a lot of effort into this and has been a leader on equal pay issues. And I wondered if you could talk from sort of more of a voluntary perspective and just sort of a good business perspective. How have you approached these issues? How have you tackled sort of questions around equal pay and sort of making sure that you have sound practices in place?
Well, I know it's something we were talking about before we came out on stage, that I do think that business has to be very intentional. We talked about that as well. You have to be very intentional. And from the GAP perspective, it's just good for business. And equal pay is part of it, but we call it a culture of equality, that we really believe when people can stand as equals, that they thrive, men and women, within the workplace. But you do have to have intentional policies. So we were the first Fortune 500 to announce in 2014. And we were quite intentional about how we looked at it. It was very important to us, one, for coming out and publicly talking about it, but also to try to set a precedent. So we actually, Jocelyn, brought in an external firm called Exponential, which is a firm that specializes in diversity and talent, to come and look at our methodology, because as you said, it's very hard to compare compensation. So we said, look, we're crunching the numbers this way. Does this make sense to you? Are we looking at it the right way? And they validated that when we announced in 2014. And then we have an annual review. And managers and others know that there's an annual review on equity. I'd say, too, a couple other intentional practices that I really appreciate as an employee of GAP, but also as a manager of GAP, is that within our pay performance process, that equity is always discussed, and it's very open. So at the company, you get, as a manager, market ranges for each of your employees of what they would make out in the open market, or what a comparable employee would make. And I have to say, as a Bay Area company, this has shifted over the years with tech. So it's not only as far as gender, but it's also what is happening in the market. So we look at that, we know the employee's salary, and then we are expected to bring them up to parity if they are not, or if there's disparities within a team of our own, or a team cross-functionally, or within the department. And we're given funds to do that. It's quite an open process to talk about it. You're expected as an employee, if you feel like there's not equity, to bring that up. And as a manager, you're held accountable for doing so. So I think that is, an annual process that, again, really infuses in the culture. Let's talk about this. It isn't such a, taboo subject to talk about equity. And then GAP also, which has just been wonderful, has done away with traditional performance review processes, as most companies do. So most companies do an annual performance review in which you are looked back, track to your goals, see what progress was against that goals, and then decide what your bonus is going to be, decide if you're going to get a promotion, decide if you're going to get a salary increase. And what we found, and the research has found, is that women are judged more harshly than men in those performance reviews. Women are often judged on stylistic things. Are you a good leader? Are you present? Which means a lot. Are you at the company when you're expected to be? And so we completely did away with them. And we infused a new performance management system called GPS. and it stands for Grow, Perform, and Succeed. It's also our stock ticker on the New York Stock Exchange. And I have to say, I really love it. And again, we've seen just a boost in productivity, that it has infused in our culture continuous improvement. Talk about it in the moment. If you're a manager and you see something that doesn't seem quite right, don't wait until the next year's performance review. Talk about it then. And for the employee, it's very helpful too, because again, it's a culture of openness and sharing. We also have shared competencies, as we call them, across the business, across cross-functionality. So there's no question at the level you're in what you're expected to do and what you need to do to get to the next level. So, and again, those competencies, which everyone buys into and agrees upon, are shared, men and women, and across the cross-functional. So we were also quite happy with GAP too, with our analysis that our equal pay is across our global organization. And I have to say, for our employees, especially our female and male employees in Japan, for instance, we're quite excited to have this be the case globally.
Right.
You know, and as I say, we really, you know, from just a top line, it's just good for business.
Right. Can you talk more about the good for business piece? Because I do think that's an important component here, that, you know, we want folks to do the right thing because that's what the law tells us to do, but, you know, there's also a more business perspective on some of this. And talk a little bit about, you know, whether or not these types of policies actually are positive from sort of a business bottom line perspective.
So we see it in two ways. Number one, women make up the majority of our workforce. We're over 70% female. We are over 70% of our senior leadership team is female, and women run 4 out of our 5 brands. Well, guess what? Women are the majority of our consumers as well. And in fact, the largest growing consumer segment is millennial women. And millennial women really care about equality. They care about, and they're going to spend their money at, places that value men and women equally, places that will come out and talk about it, places that are on the cutting edge. And at GAP, we've tried to innovate, and I can talk a little bit more about that, our policies as well, to stay in a leadership position, because we believe that equal pay is just one part of it. You also have to have other intentional processes in place to make sure there's mobility for women. Can you get women to the upper echelons of your senior leadership team? And do you believe that that would be a good practice if you do? We've certainly found that within the GAP. We also have done a flexibility program called ROW, which is short for Results Only Work Environment. It was pioneered by 2 women at Best Buy. I believe other companies are starting to adopt it. We were one of the early adopters. And basically what it is you can work from anywhere and when you want, as long as you're producing results. So again, I think from a cultural standpoint, it goes back to what are you producing and how are we getting the best talent? We compete with tech. We don't pay what tech pays. But we have found in retention and recruitment, people love these types of policies. And I have to say, the ROW system, which is wonderful, literally someone could be working in our cafe. We have video technology and other things that we've really invested in. They could be working from anywhere, and it hasn't really mattered. And I have to say, for men and women, it's been wonderful because it really takes out, we call it workplace sludge. You know, where were you? Why weren't you here? Oh, you were at your kid's baseball game. I don't have children, so I don't go to the baseball game. It has taken all of that out, and it's also taken that out of our performance reviews. Because it's not, you know, you can't be judged now on are you present. It doesn't really matter. It's what are you delivering? You know, what are your goals and what are you delivering? And so I think for men and women both at the GAP, it's wonderful to work in a place that just emphasizes that. And it helps us to get our best talent, which everybody in the company wants,
Right.
Obviously, to be able to be number one in the retail business, which we aspire to be.
Well, thank you. That's really helpful. And one of the things that you said really connects to something that I want to bring Renee into the conversation, which is the connection between equal pay and sort of broader workplace mobility. And it's interesting to me that you put this into the context of sort of a range of workplace policies, to, particularly to help retain women and the entire talent pool. And Renee, I know this is something that you've worked on for a long time and was front and center as the topic of the Glass Ceiling Commission. And so I wonder if you could also help to put the conversation about equal pay into a broader perspective. How does this connect to women's advancement overall? Why is it important? And when we think about these issues, is it just fix equal pay, or are we really talking about a broader suite of issues?
thank you, Jocelyn, for having me here, and I appreciate these comments beforehand. When you asked me, I brought this 20-year-old book, right? A Solid Investment, Making Full Use of the Nation's Human Capital, which was the recommendations of the Glass Ceiling Commission. And it looked at the three types of barriers which we still face today: the societal barriers, the institutional barriers, and the government barriers. And so when we begin to look at why do we continue to have the issue that we need to celebrate Equal Pay Day, or at least recognize it, not celebrate it, but recognize it as Equal Pay Day, is that we haven't dealt with the barriers in all three of those realms. So before we can even get into an institution, we've got to deal with the societal piece. Until women are seen as equal, deserving of dignity and respect, what we see in society, we see replicated within our institutions, within our organizations. So the work that you've done on bias and stereotype, why don't we get equal pay? Because when organizations review individuals, they're people reviewing people. So whatever bias they bring to bear to work, the same biases that we see that they display externally. When we look at the notion of what do we need, equal pay is one of many symptoms of disparity, or the lack of equal pay is one of many symptoms of disparity. Whether we're still looking at, you talked about the notion of even the performance reviews. You talked about the intentionality of an organization, the will of leadership to do something different. You talked about it starts at the top of the organization, holding leadership accountable. We also see challenges in the government arena when we look at governmental barriers, and one of them is the data and how we continue to collect data. So we look at data in terms of the need to have, quote, oversamples. Why would we not just get an accurate sample which would be reflective of the population that we serve, so that when we look at the data, we know the data sets that are being used to determine our standards are actually ones that are not filled with bias. Because we routinely hear them say we can't do an oversample because it costs too much. But then that means you don't have an accurate sample because you're not reflecting the diversity of the population. Do you count women of color as a woman? Do you count them as a minority, or racial or ethnic minority, or a woman that might be a woman with a disability? Those are still societal biases. Those are ways in which we collect data, continue to perpetuate the reasons for the gap, the systemic problems within organizations. We look at, you talked about the issue of choice. Many times when we're working with clients, whether it's the private sector or the public sector, so often the desire is to blame the individual who brought up the concern. So you lift up the concern that, well, we're not getting equal pay. Based on what I might have seen, I don't feel like I'm getting equal pay, because many times I don't feel, because we don't necessarily have the hardcore data. I see my colleagues being advanced, and everyone that seems to be getting promotional opportunities don't look like me. If I bring it up, I'm being classified as a non-high potential, a challenge within the workforce, a Nancy naysayer. So the same kind of biases that get brought up. So again, we see the equal pay as a continuing demonstration of the lack of dignity and respect that women have in society as a whole. And then within the institutions, they disproportionately are not led still by women or the majority of the society. It's still a very small demographic group that leads most of these institutions. And so when we begin to talk about them, what is the return on investment? If you call your people your greatest asset, then how are you actually investing in them? And it has to be done by design, not by default. Equal is not the same. That the challenges and the problems that might be identified with an organization need to be done in a systematic way, not simply I heard somebody. So just the way in which we begin to look at what are the barriers within the workplace, those create challenges.
Right.
How we do appraisals and evaluation, our workforce that is actually doing, our managers and supervisors, have they been adequately trained to be able to move beyond their biases? Is there consistency across the organization? So Department A, B, and C may have a policy, but the practices are quite variable. So, you look at how does it expand? It's across the board. And again, it starts with kind of who we are as a nation, and then how we get expressed within our institutions.
Right. You know, you raised several points, but really it's part of a theme. One is your point that, you know, we all come to the table as people who live in a culture, right? Like, it's not just that we magically appear, but we bring a whole bunch of things with us. And so that when we think about these issues, we have to sort of be cognizant of the broader societal context in which we operate. But then you spoke specifically about, you know, being intentional about practices, about really, and this is what Debbie spoke about too, about really making sure you have, you know, sound practices in place that really are intentional in terms of addressing these issues. And I like the connection both of you have made to, you know, equal pay as part of a broader set of strategies to ensure mobility and upward mobility for women and people of color. You know, one of the things that you alluded to, but I did want to mention specifically, is one of the things I remember about the Glass Ceiling Commission work is that you did so much intentional research looking at different constituency groups, that it wasn't just women generically, it was African American women, it was Latinas, it was Asian American women, it was men.
We looked at men
as
across
well.
the board, and again, kind of that notion of intersectionality. What does it then mean?
Right.
Not only for an individual, but
Right.
what does it mean for the institution in which they seek to work, and how do those institutions begin to address
Right.
that complexity? And until they decide to do similar to what GAP has done, to be very clear on good methodological practices to assess their organizational environment, and to do so before they have to face a lawsuit. I'm looking at the lawyers over here. To do so, again, by design,
Right.
and to see it as the business case. You know, we talk about the business case. How does it tie to mission? How does it tie to profit? How does it tie to market share? I had the opportunity to serve on the court-appointed task force that looked at Coca-Cola. And in addition to that $192.5 million settlement, there was an external body that now had oversight and responsibility for all the corporate practices. And we couldn't start with we couldn't pick just one thing to fix, and you couldn't just fix one thing kind of.
Right.
It was that the organization had to make a commitment to do a holistic look at who they were. What did recruitment look like? What did hiring look like? What did the people who do the recruitment and hiring look like? Where are they doing that recruitment and hiring? What are the standards that are being used to assess the workforce? What kind of career development was being put in place? What kind of rotational job assignments were the workforce getting? When people did get raises, were they comparable or were they equitable? Because you could say, well, everyone got a raise and everyone got a 10% raise, but if I started out below the table, then my 10% just still maybe keeps me still below the table.
Right, right.
We looked at the succession planning. We looked at the impact of equal pay and retirement, what it meant with regard and how to make a person whole.
Right.
Consequent to that.
That's, you know, it's so interesting, but I think you really both have talked about how it is an institutional commitment to really look sort of top to bottom at sort of how you do things. The other thing that you mentioned, and I want to bring Deb back into this conversation, was about data. And, you know, I love data. But you talked about why data is important and precise data that really looks at different groups of people to really understand what's happening. And, you know, one of the conversations that happens a lot is about pay data and about pay data disclosure. Deb, I wanted you to talk a little bit about why is that important? You know, sort of from a, you know, having looked at equal pay cases, you know, why is pay data interesting and important and useful to have?
Well, there are a couple of things there. I mean, I think when you talk about pay secrecy, that's a problem because women often don't know that these pay disparities exist until they have snowballed to very large numbers and they have worked there many, many years, perhaps decades. And at that point, the employer is more likely to face a lawsuit, right? Because that person feels very betrayed. What I think is most important about pay disclosure is not necessarily disclosure of the numbers themselves. Right? That's helpful, right? Because it certainly will give more information to employees about what their worth might be in this market. But in my research, I wrote about how we can't really say that we have a well-functioning compensation market because it lacks that key ingredient, which is information. Any well-functioning market needs good information. And having incentives for employers to release this data, the value is not so much in the numbers themselves, but the value is in getting employers to be more deliberate and intentional about what is it that we want to reward when we use pay, right? What matters to us? What are the factors that we're going to use to reward pay? And that, I think, is the real benefit of more openness, is that it gives employers the incentive for these kinds of voluntary efforts to really think about how are we going to reward employees. And in turn, employees are more likely to be more dedicated to that employer, more loyal. You know, the gossip happens when the pay is secret. And sometimes there's a lot of thinking that, oh, they must be getting paid more than I am, even if they're not, right? And that can lead to a lot of disgruntlement. So I think if we really want a market that's well-functioning and will get rid of discrimination, we need more open information. And that is what I've written about. And that's the real value.
You know, that is so interesting. And you said a couple of things that I think are important. One is the issue of pay secrecy, which we hear a lot about, and just the importance of eliminating this sort of notion that, you know, I'm not really sure, I have an inkling, I think something might be going on, I'm a little nervous, and that it's less about knowing exactly what people make, but also just creating an air of transparency, and that can actually work for employees and employers. One other thing I want to do is, I know, Madam Chair, that this is a topic that is front and center that you all are dealing with at the moment, and I know you're in the middle of a comment period, and so I don't want to ask you specifically about that, but tell us a little bit about why you think this is an important issue. Why is this, pay data disclosure even something that you think is an important sort of tool to have sort of in your sort of enforcement toolbox?
Thanks, Jocelyn. I can talk to you a little bit about what we've put out publicly, because this is an important issue for the Commission, and we know for across the federal government, right, the need for data. What we've found is that it's been a real barrier to understanding where the problems exist, because there isn't very good data about that. What we've done is propose to amend an existing form that we've used for over 50 years to collect information from employers about race, ethnicity, and gender by job category. So the types of jobs people in, people report the total number, so demographics of employees. And we've asked employers in our proposal to also provide pay information so that we can have a better sense of where a problem might be, where gaps might exist that require some further investigation. So the gap in itself doesn't mean there's discrimination, but it can be an indicator of a broader issue that requires looking into. So what we've done is propose that employers with at least 100 or more employees provide this information to us on an annual basis. That information we keep confidential at sort of the firm level, but what we can do is report in the aggregate what some of the pay trends are by industry, across regions, and sort of better inform the industry as well and employers about what pay looks like in their region and industry. And that can help them also as a source of data to benchmark their own pay practices. And like Deb said, our hope is that more employers, knowing they're going to report it to us, will really step out and proactively be looking at their data. We know many employers already are, and we really think that's the way to go. People like Gap leading the way and showing, look, it's not that hard, it's good for business, and we are looking forward to comments on that. We already got public comment. You know, we had a public hearing, which you were one of our witnesses at in March, and we had a public comment period. We'll have another one in the summer. So ultimately, the Commission will vote on a final proposal.
You. And we're going to get ready to take some questions in a couple minutes. So I want folks to think about what their questions are. Debbie, I want to ask you, my limited experience chatting with a few employers here and there is pay is always really hard. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, why is this issue so difficult and challenging, you think, to deal with in the workplace setting? And, what's the advice you would give to employers who are sort of grappling with these issues, given that you guys have been trying to work on it and sort of changing the culture of the workplace? What do you think the challenge is here for folks?
Well, it's interesting because since Gap announced equal pay and our external validation to it in 2014, we've seen other companies come out with equal pay, right? And we salute them, absolutely. We do think it'd be better from a market perspective if all companies did it. I know Salesforce, it's been fascinating to see that Mark Benioff, talked about it, made it a personal commitment, said, look, I'm going to take a look at this. And, he did. And then he said, okay, I'm seeing some disparity here, and I think it was $3 million that they invested. And he was quite open and public about it. I think that they found men were also being underpaid. And so, again, it was good for their culture and good for their company. I know that Intel, and this is something we're looking at, has said we're going to take a look by race and do another dive down, which, again, so I think more of these open discussions publicly and from people at the top. At Gap, we're lucky that we were co-founded by a woman, Doris Fisher, who still comes around. She's still at the Gap Cafe, still driving her station wagon, and comes. And her expectations are very clear about the culture, but I do think it starts from the top. So, I think if you're a person in a company that is trying to influence the culture, I think to get some allies, and really start looking at how do you influence this. And again, it's something that I think the more that you can frame it in a business case, because it certainly is, of why it benefits your business. We're all for-profit businesses, so it's the way that our leaders need to think. Again, I think that it's that idea of good for business and good for the talent, and everyone's vying for the best talent.
Right. And, Renee, we were talking earlier, it is 20 years after the Glass Ceiling Commission ended, and we certainly have made progress, but we are still talking about progress that we need to make. And you have tons of clients where you work on these issues. What's your advice? What do you give to people? Tell people about how do we need to sort of continue that progress and continue that move forward. Not only around equal pay, but just as you pointed out, sort of making full use of all of our nation's talent. What do you tell folks?
We start out by tying the import of people to the organization's mission, because that allows whatever the organization's mission is, that really is how they then begin to build their business case, number one. Number two, we say budgets are statements of priorities and values, and how organizations budget their resources, budget their time, speaks a lot. So what those budgets look like, and are they showing parity? Are they equitable across different divisions? Are they equitable across the various diversity? I think the final thing we say is that that leadership matters. And what are the mechanisms within the organization that holds leadership accountable? Because part of leading is that the good leaders lead by example. They put in place practices, not only policies, but practices that get assessed across the board, not just for mid-level managers, but all the way up, including holding senior leaders accountable. And we find that when they have peer or collective compensation protocols, meaning that we tie all vice presidents to the improved performance of your workforce on all of the measures of diversity.
Right.
And it's not just about number counting. It also is about the quality of the workplace, what we say, the smell of the place, the culture, the climate in which people work. That also affects our ability to begin to perceive and see others within our workforce as equitable, capable, competent to be promoted. So those would be the three primary areas that we would recommend.
Well, thank you. This has really been extraordinarily helpful, just in terms of teasing out sort of what are the challenges that we face in terms of achieving equal pay, but also how it connects to the broader conversation and the broader effort to strengthen all of our workplaces. So, Deborah Eisenberg. Jenny Yang, Debbie Meslow, Renee Redwood, thank you so much for all of your insights and expertise. And now I think we can open it up to a couple of questions in the audience. And I see a hand back there.
Hi, Pamela Kukas. I'm an independent pay equity consultant, and I love data too. And I thought one of the most interesting things to drop this week was the study from Hired and their database about starting pay. And, you know, we're vindicated. We've always suspected that there was a problem in the decision making that happens at Hire, and they found 7 out of 10 times, same job, same company, the men are getting higher offers, right? And what's interesting about that is not just the finding, but also it's a new data source. So data scientists are like on our team now because they have access to cross-firm information that is really hard for anybody to see, not the government, not one company looking at their own information. So I'm just really interested to see what else we could do with the world of big data, right? And complementing all these other pieces.
You know, thank you so much. That's such an interesting point because Hired came out with some research recently. Glassdoor has done something, I think PayScale. And so there are these sort of independent databases that have an enormous amount of information. And I think, you know, it goes back to something the chair was saying earlier, which is that so much of the conversation about equal pay is, you know, it's choices, it's all this, it's all that, it's very complicated. And a lot of the cases that you see are sort of basic, right? Like it's like the exact same job, the woman is making, you know, $15,000, $20,000 less. And, you know, it's not rocket science to figure out that's just not right. And I think, you know, it really goes also back to what Deb was saying earlier about how the law operates, right? That it's just, you know, there's still things that we need to just fix that are just sort of basic, that were basic in 1963, right? Like the concept of equal pay for work means that you don't get to pay somebody $20,000 less for doing the same job. But I don't know if any of you want to talk specifically about data. I mean, I know you look a lot at data, you're thinking a lot about data. I don't know if there are opportunities to work with some of these outside sources around data collection. They have a lot of information. I think those studies are really fascinating.
One of the interesting things about these more public sources of data like Glassdoor and others is I do think it's starting to create the business case for change in addition to the public awareness, because part of the challenge is that, you know, if people were reluctant to talk about pay or employers actually had policies that prohibited people talking about pay, there was very little risk of the pay disparity being discovered. Right? So you could sort of say, well, we want to pay people as little as possible, and we don't think we'll have a problem later. But now companies like The Gap, what they said on our panel the other day was, look, we don't want to buy ourselves a problem in the future. We want to fix it now. And the more risk there is that people are going to find out I'm not being paid fairly, the bigger problem you're going to have later. So that's another message that we really want to get out to employees. Like, look at it now, because while you can, if you have a starting salary problem, often what I've seen in my practice is that your pay setting practice is part of the problem.
Right.
It isn't paying people really based on job-related experience, and it's bringing in all types of bias about, you know, how we value men and women's experience generally.
Right.
And that's importing it into the workplace. So I think those are really important issues, and that data source is kind of creating a different narrative.
Right, absolutely.
I think that. Go ahead.
The only thing I'd say on the data too is that when we look at these data sources, really being acutely aware of data integrity. How is the data being gathered? Who's actually, and again, I always talk about who's looking at the data, because as you noted, one of the things we did with Glass Ceiling Commission, and we did even before that, was having different researchers bring different perspectives, because the data may tell me one story, but it may tell Deb another story, right? And so while, again, we bring those lenses to bear, we also then bring different kinds of questions to the methodology. Is this data set sufficiently large enough for me to be able to see what women of color look like within the different maybe potential pay grades or different divisions or the different industries or occupations.
Right.
Those are important,
Right.
Particularly when you're trying to argue comparable worth.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I was going to support and say, from a methodology standpoint, which is something that GAP really wanted to look at, again, when we were crunching our numbers, knowing that we'd probably be the first to come out, but hopefully others would follow. How are we looking at this? How could we be compared to other companies? How can we work together? I think when the public sector and avenues such as this celebrates achievements on the private side, how can we work with other companies around consistent methodology so that we can truly see if this trend is improving?
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I think I saw another question over here. Jim?
So I really want to thank you. This is an incredibly informative panel. I have a slightly different question to ask that actually builds on a little bit of what the chair was saying. For those of us who have been working on this issue for a long, long time, which includes all of you, it seems like we've reached a new kind of crescendo. I felt like this Equal Pay Day, my inbox was exploding with not just statements, but new studies, corporations talking about what they're doing, kind of a new awareness of maybe the legitimacy of the issue. And I've gotten a lot of questions from people saying, why do you think that's the case? I have my own hypotheses, but I'd be interested to hear from some of you if you agree, in fact, that there is kind of a notch up in awareness, and what are some of the reasons behind it so that we can continue to move it up and actually, reach some of the change we're trying to get.
My standard answer, Hillary Clinton. I think issues around gender are now taking greater public visibility. I think the more that we speak out as women, the more that the data starts to show that what people have been feeling, experiencing, knowing is not just that one individual, but it is systemic. I think those are some of the impetus for why we're seeing greater public discourse, but also too in the marketplace. Look at the marketplace. Who's making the purchasing decisions?
That's right. That's right.
Who's making the decisions on healthcare, which then healthcare is another proxy for expenditure.
Right.
Part of what I've seen is people are willing to come talk about it. Public figures and celebrities. We just met earlier with Patricia Arquette, and she was talking about why it was so important for her to talk about it. She didn't hesitate to raise this issue. And the more people who are, outstanding and leaders in their field, Sheryl Sandberg really sparked a conversation with Lean In, and that was continued. So I think that when you see people willing to talk about it, you see the problems everywhere, and we need to do something about it.
Right,
So
right.
I'm hopeful that this opportunity and this awareness really creates momentum for change.
Right.
The studies too. Was it
Yeah.
the McKinsey
Yeah.
report
The
that
data.
talked
Yeah.
about how you could unlock so much of the world's wealth by paying women equally?
Right.
I think that back to that data point of we're actually seeing that come out now.
Right. I completely agree, and I think it's it may be a political climate, it may be women sort of raising these issues more. I do think there's been a lot of corporate activism, across a lot of issues that we're having a conversation about these days, and people trying to talk through how do they, sort of live their values, in the workplace and outside. So I think there's a lot going on, but I think it's a really great question to ask. We're going to wrap up. Oh, okay. I am getting the signal. When I get that signal that we need to wrap up. But if panelists have time, because I know there are a couple other people who have questions, please feel free to come up. I just want to say thank you again in helping us to really parse through what I think is a complicated issue. But I think it was really important to be able to talk about where we are, what are some of the things that we can do to sort of improve where we are, but also how this conversation connects to a broader conversation about how do we strengthen our workplaces and make sure that we're really giving everybody a fair chance to succeed. So thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your time today. And thank you to those of you who joined us here, both here and listening to live stream or watching us on live stream about a conversation about next steps on equal pay. Thank you.
Thank you.